Shame is about hiding, about absence, neglect. It's about embarrassment, lack of self-worth, secrets, dishonesty, fear of exposure to your family, to your friends, and to your loved ones. Shame is what we believe other people believe about us. Shame is a sickness that keeps us unwell. I lived in shame, addicted to heroin from the age of 15. I lost jobs, girlfriends, sitting in bedsits, sticking needles in my arm, sitting in prison cells, removed from society. Shame was deeply ingrained.
This was my mother, Helen. She didn't raise me. She was addicted to alcohol, heroin, anything that eased the pressures of this world. She went from this to this. Her house went from being full of pride and people to being full of shame and suffering. I hid her all of my life because of other people's reactions to her addictions. I told school friends she was dead. It was easier that way. Helen loved travelling around India earlier in her life. She believed in crystals, listened to the Grateful Dead, Dylan, stood up for gay rights and environmental issues, collected antiques, loved dogs, and practiced Buddhism, tarot, and astrology. She believed in freedom, but she was tied to shame, and she was hiding from the world. Here is her last benefit claim form. I really worry a lot and fear the outside world and the change that may happen. Filling in this form has worried me, and now I'm worried it will be okay. She didn't like to be called mother. I was an anchor to her freedom. Helen died hiding in her basement with drug paraphernalia rising to the surface and her friends all around her. I stood in her basement flat after her death and I took photographs to try to understand her, to understand addiction, to try to somehow capture it all before the council came to whitewash it away.
We met in recovery, Lisa for drinking and me for drugs. We fell in love, but I soon relapsed and it parted us. I was living in a dirty bedsit with no furniture, unable to be with her anymore because my life had spiralled out of control, again. I went days without sleeping or eating properly, and by the time I got to prison, I looked like a corpse. Drugs were my solution to my thoughts and feelings, providing me with a haze of immunity to fear and low self-esteem. My paranoia, insecurities, and delusions had pushed everyone away. I'd driven a person I loved almost to a breakdown, and I was ready to die. I was malnourished, unmanageable, and often covered in my own blood from repeatedly sticking needles in myself and other forms of self-harm. This was the jumping off point. I couldn't keep using, but I couldn't stop. So I carried on. When I finally came crashing to a halt in a police cell and close to death was when my problems really began. The guilt, the shame, degradation, anger, fear, all pouring out of me with every bead of sweat. I'd lost everything, and the most incredible person I'd ever met, I'd hurt the most. When that haze is gone, you're left with nowhere to direct the noisy thoughts, except at yourself.
I was encouraged to leave Elliot. So many people told me that I was better than him, that he didn't deserve me. I was told to get rid. I was told he was a dirty junkie. His addictions led him to some hurtful and destructive behaviours. But I knew that he was running and hiding, not only from the police and others, but from himself. Some friends turned their back on me when I didn't leave Elliot. I found it very hard to find the support I needed to be able to support him. People were the same about my mother throughout my life. They said she was selfish, that she chose drink and drugs over me, her only child. I knew that drink and drugs were a way of untying herself from the shame of her past, her present, and of me. But drink and drugs began to control and confine her, tying her to her home, a basement flat with boarded windows and several padlocks on the front gate. I couldn't support my mother. She didn't want help. Maybe she was too proud to ask. Maybe she was covering a lifetime of shame. She didn't want to give up drink and drugs. She just wanted more.
I thought I was a bad person, but later realised that through covering my mental health issues and feeding my addiction, I just had bad behaviours that needed addressing. What I did wasn't who I was. I'd always been in a life of running and hiding, of not talking about my issues and not connecting with people. I was ashamed to feel so out of place in the world. And my solution was heroin, which just led to more shame and silence. I was cut off from society and confined long before I went to prison. I realised it had become a physical manifestation when I was sat on the prison bus, or sweatbox as we called it, looking out of a tiny tinted window at a world that couldn't see me.
I felt a familiar distance between us, the distance I had with my mother. I couldn't see him just as I couldn't see her. We were silenced, only able to speak to and see each other at controlled times. There was the devastating pain of parting and very little support and understanding around it. I was a carer in many ways, but I kept it a secret, facing financial and emotional strain, but unable to speak about it. The first and only time that Elliot and my mother Helen met, they compared collapsed veins from injecting heroin. This is the second time they were in close proximity to each other. Here is a photograph of my mother's ashes in the prison reception lockers where Elliot was incarcerated. I collected her ashes on the same day that I had a prison visit. I opened the locker, placed her inside, and I stood there staring. It hit me. I stood in front of two realities of using drink and drugs. Both were self-medicating for mental health issues in their past. Both were hiding for years. Both were let down by systems, and both were punished. I put this photo and the photos of my mother's house onto social media to show my friends what I'd been hiding. Then I began exploring my mother's life through her belongings and the drug paraphernalia in the photographs I'd taken. Elliot's letters and calls from prison during this time helped me to understand her and her addictions. His letters were incredible, and through writing regularly from prison, his English levels improved. We decided to put it all out there. I'd transcribe our calls and type his letters and put them onto social media. I'd recorded Elliot using heroin before prison. He wanted to be recorded to show he still had some control over the way he used heroin. I wanted him to see that he didn't have control over his movements, over his breathing, over his life. When he was well, we decided this documentation was powerful and that our voices needed to be heard. But how could people hear voices behind walls? In the home, in prison? How do we undo the shame?
My recovery began in prison after opening up about my issues during phone conversations with Lisa and discussing the darkest corners of my mind. When I started writing and telling stories of my experiences, it gave life and meaning to everything I tried so hard to keep hidden. I also noticed that when I spoke with honesty and transparency, it not only alleviated any feelings of shame in myself, but also encouraged others to open up too. Shame is characterized by feelings of wanting to disconnect and disappear from view. With my issues of mental illness and addiction leading me to be physically isolated and out of society, the only way back in was for me to say, hey, you know what? I can't hide this stuff anymore, and I'm tired of trying to pull a disappearing act. Does anyone else feel the same? There's a saying that goes, you can't save your face and your arse at the same time. And this rang true for me. I thought I had to present as somebody who had themselves together, as I perceived everybody else to be. But after opening up, I realised no one actually has their stuff together. I was judging my insides by other people's outsides.
We were identifying shame. We did this by writing up to 400 words a day. We explored our story and what led us to where we were. We were disciplined, and our small sections put out on social media turned into large chunks, enough to put in a book. People joined, other people who had been hiding, addicted, or supporting someone through addiction and recovery, or those who had lost loved ones, or supporting others through prison. We all began joining together, telling our stories, and it grew into a loving and supportive community. People began to connect and care. They wanted a better understanding for their future. This was a place where people would undo the shame in their lives by speaking out, by listening, by accepting, by praising, by supporting. Supporters need supporting too, without judgments. It's not us that needs silencing, it's the shame that needs silencing.
I wanted to start again, and I spoke to Lisa about changing my name. I was worried about the newspaper articles and my mugshot on search engines. Imagine Googling your name and only seeing pictures of you at your worst, ill, withdrawing from drugs. Anything to do with my name didn't look good, and I was anxious about seeing it all when I was released. It increased the anxiety in me. It increased the shame.
But I told Elliot that these newspaper articles with his mugshot were the portfolio of his experiences, of his recovery. If we began to tell our story, we could begin to write over and undo the shame. We didn't have to hide our stories. We could tell our stories to be seen, to empower, and to enable change.
The same newspapers that posted my mugshot were now asking for new stories of love, strength, and recovery. We began getting messages from all over the world. Compassion was key. The majority of people in UK prisons will be released back into society. Who would you want living in your community? Somebody treated badly by the system upon release from prison, hostile, resentful, further criminalised, and potentially more dangerous. Or somebody who had the time, care and support put in to help them function, contribute and thrive in society.
I struggled to help him, but I put the hard graft in, the hard work the prison system didn't do. I became his Google nurse, his counsellor, his 24-hour advice line. I understood him. I also understood my mother's struggles with addiction through being so close to Elliot. Addiction wasn't the issue. The issues were the underlying, unaddressed things, and using drugs helped to cover over those. I didn't need to forgive my mother for not raising me, because she was sick. And I was able to tell her that before she died, that she didn't need to feel ashamed. We kept talking about our experiences, and people began stepping forward. We began to build a network. Doctors, people in prison, people detoxing, supporters, students, people from a variety of backgrounds came to us and reached out within the network we'd created. The community we were building became aware that we need to take responsibility for each other. Overstretched and underfunded health services and a prison system ill-equipped to deal with addiction and mental health means that loved ones are doing a lot of the exhausting work for free and out of love.
It would be easy at this point for us to say it's obvious the prison system isn't working, but it is. Prison is designed to hold those that society doesn't want to include anymore based on their behaviour, without acknowledging that the behaviour is a manifestation or symptom of further reaching and deeper issues. Prison is contradictory to the values of modern society, where we talk about inclusivity and diversity. People from minority ethnic backgrounds, low-income areas, people with mental illnesses, trauma and addiction issues, care leavers, people with disabilities, all overrepresented in the UK prison system. Prison officers are the staff that those in prison will interact with the most. The Prison Reform Trust reports that 40% of prisons inspected in 2016 to 17 had inadequate or no training for prison officers to know when to refer a person for mental health support. In the prisons I spent time in, this was certainly the case. Why do frontline officers not receive this training as standards when there is such prevalence of mental illness in our prisons? I started out by speaking about my experiences, not just in prison, but the years leading up to me being locked up. We explained every aspect of our story to add context to it, in order to undo any shame and stigma around it. Social media and news should reflect real society. My transparency led to opportunities to share more, to try to help others, to share more to help others through writing and speaking. I now work delivering sessions in schools to teenagers around subjects such as drugs, mental health, and crime. Talking openly about my experiences on topics that were only used for scaremongering when I was their age. And I'm almost 3 years clean.
Because I supported someone in prison and through addiction doesn't make me a supporting role. I am equal in this. This is my story to tell too. I felt and experienced addiction and prison. These issues affect us all. Speaking out together is about new insights, new understandings, learning through the process of sharing, engaging with people you might not otherwise, creating new communities, widening opportunities. I am responsible for you, and you are responsible for me. Remember, my mother Helen wrote on her benefits claim form that she worried a lot and feared the outside world. She died surrounded by the friends she had taken in. They looked out for each other when society didn't. We are all deeply, profoundly responsible for one another, for reaching out with compassion and empathy to everyone we meet, and those hidden from society. This is how we can undo shame.